This week's readings discuss the plight of American Jewry. Author Irving Kristol sheds intriguing light on the political ramifications, as well as future predicted trends of Jewish influence on American politics. In The Political Dilemma of American Jews, Irving Kristol addresses his take on Jewish America in the early 1980s, which he believed was in the midst of a crisis due to unanticipated events between Jews and the changing relationships that had occurred between them and various groups in America. Using a quote from Erik Erikson's biography on Martin Luther, Kristol outlines his crisis as being parallel to the three critical stages in the life cycle of the individual. The first is a crisis in identity, which he sees through the emergence of Jesse Jackson as the political leader of the post-civil rights African-American community. Written during Jesse Jackson's first presidential campaign in 1984, as well as the aftermath of Jackson's remarks that Jews were living in Hymietown, Kristol worries the emergence of Jackson and his anti-Semitic rhetoric represent a growing divide in the two minority communities. Jackson's rise as the voice of Black America may seem like a footnote in American history today, but at the time Kristol wrote this piece, it was a real issue, and perhaps Kristol has hit on some causal reactionary that lives on today. Kristol writes that Jackson stands for Black nationalism, that he is militant, radically redefining the role of Black political leadership in America. He then implies that regardless of Jackson, this attitude is now prevalent within the Black community, that it is their status quo. His message seems theoretically logical, but it is a radical argument, especially when looking back with a historical lens nearly 30 years later. At the core of Kristol's assault, it becomes clear when Kristol implies that Jesse Jackson is pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel. In 1984, this power could potentially mean the office of the presidency. His role in future elections did seem bound to be significant at the time. Citing a commitment from Jackson to stump for a properly militant Black candidate against Mayor Koch in the upcoming Democratic primaries in New York City, Kristol writes, the Black-Jewish polarization would be too scary to even contemplate. Today, the article seems irrelevant in this regard, maybe even flat-out wrong. While his predictions for the future were very far off, everything he writes seems to be rooted in factual information. Information that is still relevant and actually gives insight to the modern-day state of politics. In some instances, Kristol's neoconservative points even ring a little true. While the Jackson case may not seem like the best argument, the second crisis facing American Jews is a crisis of conscience, which Kristol analyzes through the dynamics shaping up between American Jews and the moral majority. At the time, in the early 80s, the rise of the moral majority was another new feature the American Jewish landscape did not understand. It was unanticipated. Kristol writes, they did not expect it, do not understand it, and do not know what to do about it. Most of their bafflement is because the moral majority is so strongly pro-Israel. Normally, such a powerful revival of Christian fundamentalism, as well as conservative views as a religious force, would have been an alarm to Jews. But the times were changing. The moral majority was on the side of the Jewish homeland. At the time this article was written, the moral majority was an unanticipated arrival, not fitting into the spectrum of the familiar and expected. Additionally, the moral majority evoked a hostile reaction among most Jewish Americans. The moral majority's zealous commitment to social issues like school prayer, anti-abortion, and other matters that sought to change the relation of church and state would normally bring an alarm to most Jews. Kristol, however, believes there's little cause for concern, and that the moral majority will eventually change the dynamic between Jews and the conservative party, the Republicans. In the years since this publication, I believe it is safe to say he is right. Ever since the Holocaust and the emergence of the State of Israel, American Jews have been reaching toward a more explicit and meaningful Jewish identity. And nowhere does this identity manifest itself more than through the State of Israel. The pride Jews feel towards their Jewish homeland is undeniable. Since Kristol's article was published, there has surely been a change in the political demographic of Jews. The third crisis is integrity, which in the case of American Jews means coming to terms with historical actuality. Like Jesse Jackson and the moral majority, Kristol links American Judaism and American foreign policy as another new, unanticipated occurrence. During the time of this article, the United Nations and the attitude of our major Jewish organizations were different. Kristol believes the UN was bent on delegitimizing Israel, destroying it even. Kristol believed the UN showed the slightest interest in protecting the rights of Jews and other minorities, especially in the Soviet Union and in Muslim nations. Crystal believes these three factors, Jackson, the moral majority, and the United Nations, mostly in regards to their views on Israel, will change the Jewish agenda in the years to come. In many ways, he was right, but his reasoning for how this would happen was not always the driving force. He concludes by mentioning academia and the media, as well as philanthropy, and the shift that these three will change in the future. Changes because of Jewish sentiment. In the case of academia, Crystal believes the attitude will sharpen rather than soften, and he believes the media will follow suit. The rise of Fox News and other conservative outlets today surely make a case for his prediction. In 1984, as with today, the American Jewish community was seeing changes in their relationships with traditional allies. And Irving Kristol, a Depression-era American student, radically turned into a reactionary conservative, was often described as the godfather of American neoconservatism. He believed the changing relationships between Jews and their traditional allies would transform the political landscape of the United States in the later part of the 20th century and early 21st. It's safe to say many of his predictions are correct. His logic may not have always been right, but anyone who knows Kristol knows he is a fervent believer in the rights of Israel and the Jewish people, that his neoconservatism was less a policy agenda than a cast of mind, which he called a moving spirit, promoting an activist agenda of republicanism, as well as pro-Jewish political thinking. Throughout Kristol's career, he portrays a Jewish community whose value system should be largely determined by the criteria of expediency and self-interest, abandoning a model of interdependence and interrelationship within his country. Indeed, his own agenda was marked by a similar shift as the one he preaches. Kristol's ideology has been a pendulum of the political spectrum. Born in Brooklyn, New York, the son of a non-observant Jewish immigrant family from Eastern Europe, Kristol was originally a vocal Trotskyist, eventually becoming part of the New York intellectual class, along with other influential Jewish names like Saul Bellow, Irving Howe, Alfred Kazan, and Susan Sontag. In the 50s, however, Kristol would shift his views and become the original voice of neoconservatism. Since his death in 2009, Irving Kristol has been one of the most influential public intellectual of the latter half of the 20th century. I'd like to conclude with some final thoughts and facts to help give insight into this week's readings. The first being the makeup of Jews in the world. The worldwide Jewish population is 13.3 million Jews. The population of American Jews is estimated to be approximately 5,128,000, or 1.7% of the total population. 300,000 include those who identify themselves culturally as Jewish, but not necessarily religious. The first Jewish immigrants to settle in the United States were 23 Sephardic Jews who arrived in New Amsterdam, later known as New York, in 1654. In the years that followed, large waves of Jewish immigrants of Eastern Europe descent, known as Ashkenazi Jews, came to America, mostly between the years 1881 and 1924. One-third of the Jewish population in Eastern Europe immigrated because of changing political and economic conditions. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, tens and sometimes hundreds of thousands of Jews arrived in America annually. The immigration of some 2.4 million Eastern European Jews boosted the American Jewish population from roughly 250,000 in 1881 to 4.5 million by 1924. The most recent Jewish immigrants to come to America were in the 80s, during the political turmoil of the Soviet Union, which Kristol speaks of in his article, when degrading the UN. Since then, however, the Jewish population in America has decreased. Jewish Americans, however, have found it rather easy to assimilate to American society and have established themselves as a force politically and economically. For the most part, Americans appreciate the goods and services provided by the Jewish merchants of the time. The religious freedom guaranteed by the separation of church and state is vitally important to American Jews. Thanks for listening. I'll have more questions posted throughout the week.